大家好，又到讀你聽嘅時間。今日繼續讀 A.Christie 嘅450 from Paddington 啦，嚟到第23節。咁上一回22節呢，就有一個突破性嘅消息啦，就係呢個馬天呢，竟然係在生嘅，生勾勾咁樣出現喺 Emma 面前啦，就話俾佢聽，佢就係馬天啦，即係話咧呢個死者呢，就並唔係馬天啦，另有其人。至於係邊個呢？呢一刻係唔知道嘅。呢一個馬天呢，亦都有和盤托出啦。佢同 Edmund 生前呢，即係佢就有一段關係嘅，的確。咁佢亦都係真係有翻過嚟英國嘅。但係呢，佢就冇寫過信俾 Emma， 即係話呢 Emma 所收到嘅信呢係假冒嘅。咁究竟係邊個寫嘅呢？唔知道，呢一刻係唔知道，只能夠相信呢個馬天講嘅，佢亦都冇必要講大話。咁呢個偽冒做出嚟嘅形象就係想人以為馬天係死者啦。寫封信嘅人相信係佢係知道個死者嘅身份，好大可能係兇手啦，去做一個掩飾啦。Anyway， 我哋繼續讀落去啦，第23節。The streamlined secretary brought Harold Crackenthorpe his usual afternoon cup of tea. Thanks, Miss Alice. I shall be going home early today. I'm sure you ought really not to have come at all, Mr. Crackenthorpe, said Miss Alice. You look quite pulled down still. I'm all right, said Harold Crackenthorpe, but he did feel pulled down. No doubt about it. He'd had a very nasty turn. Ah well, that was over. Extraordinary, he thought broodingly, that Alfred should have succumbed and the old man should have come through. After all, what was he, 73, 74? Been an invalid for years. If there was one person you'd have thought would have been taken off, it would have been the old man. But no, it had to be Alfred. Alfred, who, as far as Harold knew, was a healthy, wiry sort of chap. Nothing much the matter with him. He leaned back in his chair, sighing. That girl was right. He didn't feel up to things yet, but he had wanted to come down to the office, wanted to get the hang of how affairs were going, touch and go. All this, he looked round him, the richly appointed office, the pale gleaming wood, the expensive modern chairs. It all looked prosperous enough, and a good thing too. That's where Alfred had always gone wrong. If you looked prosperous, people thought you were prosperous. There were no rumors going around as yet about his financial stability. All the same, the crash couldn't be delayed very long. Now, if only his father had passed out instead of Alfred, as surely he ought to have done. Practically seemed to thrive on arsenic. Yes, if his father had succumbed, well, there wouldn't have been anything to worry about. Still, the great thing was not to seem worried. A prosperous appearance. Not like poor old Alfred, who always looked seedy and shiftless, who looked in fact exactly what he was. One of those small-time speculators, never going all out boldly for the big money. In with a shady crowd here, doing a doubtful deal there, never quite rendering himself liable to prosecution, but going very near the edge. And where had it got him? Short periods of affluence and then back to seediness and shabbiness once more. No broad outlook about Alfred. Taken all in all, you couldn't say Alfred was much lost. He'd never been particularly fond of Alfred, and with Alfred out of the way, the money that was coming to him from that old curmudgeon, his grandfather, would be sensibly increased, divided not into 5 shares, but into 4 shares. Very much better. Harold's face brightened a little. He rose, took his hat and coat, and left the office. Better take it easy for a day or two. He wasn't feeling too strong yet. His car was waiting below, and very soon he was weaving through London traffic to his house. Darwin, his manservant, opened the door. Her ladyship has just arrived, sir, he said. For a moment Harold stared at him. Alice, good heavens, was it today that Alice was coming home? He'd forgotten all about it. Good thing Darwin had warned him. It wouldn't have looked so good if he'd gone upstairs and looked too astonished at seeing her. Not that it really mattered, he supposed. Neither Alice nor he had any illusions about the feeling he had for each other. Perhaps Alice was fond of him. He didn't know. All in all, Alice was a great disappointment to him. He hadn't been in love with her, of course, but though a plain woman, she was quite a pleasant one. and her family and connections had doubtfully been useful. Not perhaps as useful as they might have been, because in marrying Alice he had been considering the position of hypothetical children. Nice relations for his boys to have. But there hadn't been any boys or girls either, and all that had remained had been he and Alice growing older together, without much to say to each other, and with no particular pleasure in each other's company. She stayed away a good deal with relations and usually went to the Riviera in the winter. It suited her and it didn't worry him. He went upstairs now into the drawing room and greeted her punctiliously. "So, you're back, my dear. Sorry I couldn't meet you, but I was held up in the city. I got back as early as I could. How was San Rafael?" Alice told him how San Rafael was. She was a thin woman with sandy-colored hair, a well-arched nose, and vague hazel eyes. She talked in a well-bred, monotonous, and rather depressing voice. It had been a good journey back, the channel a little rough. The customs, as usual, very trying at Dover. "You should come by air," said Harold, as he always did. "So much simpler." "I dare say, but I don't really like air travel. I never have. Makes me nervous." "Saves a lot of time," said Harold. Lady Alice Crackenthorpe did not answer. It was possible that her problem in life was not to save time, but to occupy it. She inquired politely after her husband's health. "Emma's telegram quite alarmed me," she said. "You were all taken ill, I understand." Yes, said Harold. "I read in the paper the other day," said Alice, "of 40 people in the hotel going down with food poisoning at the same time. All this refrigeration is dangerous, I think. People keep things too long in them." "Possibly," said Harold. Should he or should he not mention arsenic? Somehow, looking at Alice, he felt himself quite unable to do so. In Alice's world, he felt, there was no place for poisoning by arsenic. It was a thing you read about in the papers. It didn't happen to you or your own family, but it had happened in the Crackenthorpe family. He went up to his room and lay down for an hour or two before dressing for dinner. At dinner, tete-a-tete with his wife, the conversation ran on much the same lines. Desultory, polite. The mention of acquaintances and friends at San Rafael. "There's a parcel for you on the hall table, a small one," Alice said. "Is there? I didn't notice it. It's an extraordinary thing, but somebody was telling me about a murdered woman having been found in the barn, or something like that. She said it was at Rutherford Hall. I suppose it must be some other Rutherford Hall." "No," said Harold. "No, it isn't. It was in our barn, as a matter of fact." "Really, Harold? A murdered woman in the barn at Rutherford Hall? And you never told me anything about it." "Well, there hasn't been much time, really," said Harold, "and it was all rather unpleasant. Nothing to do with us, of course. The press milled around a good deal. Of course, we had to deal with the police and all that sort of thing." "Very unpleasant," said Alice. "Did they find out who did it?" she added, with rather perfunctory interest. "Not yet," said Harold. "What sort of woman was she?" "Nobody knows. French, apparently." "Oh, French," said Alice, and allowing for the difference in class, her tone was not unlike that of Inspector Bacon. "Very annoying for you all," she agreed. They went out from the dining room and crossed into the small study where they usually sat when they were alone. Harold was feeling quite exhausted by now. "I'll go up to bed early," he thought. He picked up the small parcel from the hall table, about which his wife had spoken to him. It was a small, neatly waxed parcel, done up with meticulous exactness. Harold ripped it open as he came to sit down in his usual chair by the fire. Inside was a small tablet box bearing the label, "2 to be taken nightly." With it was a small piece of paper with the chemist's heading in Brackhampton. "Sent by request of Dr. Quimper" was written on it. Harold Crackenthorpe frowned. He opened the box and looked at the tablets. Yes, they seemed to be the same tablets he had been having. But surely Quimper had said that he needn't take any more. "You won't want them now," that's what Quimper had said. "What is it, dear?" said Alice. "You look worried." "Oh, it's just some tablets. I've been taking them at night. But I rather thought the doctor said don't take any more." His wife said placidly, "He probably said don't forget to take them." "He may have done, I suppose," said Harold doubtfully. He looked across at her. She was watching him. Just for a moment or two he wondered. He didn't often wonder about Alice, exactly what she was thinking. That mild gaze of hers told him nothing. Her eyes were like windows in the empty house. What did Alice think about him, feel about him? Had she been in love with him once? He supposed she had. Or did she marry him because she thought he was doing well in the city, and she was tired of her own precarious existence? Well, on the whole, she'd done quite well out of it. She got a car and a house in London. She could travel abroad when she felt like it and get herself expensive clothes, though goodness knows they never looked like anything on Alice. Yes, on the whole, she'd done pretty well. He wondered if she thought so. She wasn't really fond of him, of course, but then he wasn't really fond of her. They had nothing in common, nothing to talk about, no memories to share. If there had been children, but there hadn't been any children. Odd that there were no children in the family except young Eddie's boy, young Eddie. She'd been a silly girl, making that foolish, hasty wartime marriage. Well, he'd given her good advice. He had said, "It's all very well, these dashing young pilots, glamour, courage, all that, but he'll be no good in peacetime, you know. Probably be barely able to support you." And Eddie had said, what did it matter? She loved Brian, and Brian loved her, and he'd probably be killed quite soon. Why shouldn't they have some happiness? What was the good of looking to the future when they might well be bombed any minute? And after all, Eddie had said, the future doesn't really matter because someday there'll be all grandfather's money. Harold squirmed uneasily in his chair. Really, that will of his grandfather's had been iniquitous, keeping them all dangling on a string. The will hadn't pleased anybody. It didn't please the grandchildren, and it made their father quite livid. The old boy was absolutely determined not to die. That's what made him take so much care of himself. But he'd have to die soon. Surely he'd have to die soon. Otherwise, all Harold's worries swept over him once more, making him feel sick and tired and giddy. Alice was still watching him, he noticed. Those pale, thoughtful eyes. They made him uneasy somehow. "I think I should go to bed," he said. "It's been my first day out in the city." "Yes," said Alice. "I think that's a good idea. I'm sure the doctor told you to take things easily at first." "Doctors always tell you that," said Harold. "And don't forget to take your tablets, dear," said Alice. She picked up the box and handed it to him. He said good night and went upstairs. Yes, he needed the tablets. It would have been a mistake to take them off too soon. He took 2 of them and swallowed them with a glass of water. 好，呢次講完。哇，好罕有啊！全節都係講 Harold。咁亦都有更多嘅篇幅咧係講佢嘅太太Alice。咁Alice咧就似乎就帶咗2粒藥丸，包裝得好靚嘅，就俾 Harold 食嘅。咁Harold 咧就有啲疑惑啦，因為佢記得 Dr. Quimper 叫佢唔好食。咁但係佢太太就話：可能佢叫你唔記得食咧。咁然之後 Harold 咧到最後咧都係決定食嘅。似乎係一個唔好嘅預兆啦。Harold 會唔會係食咗藥之後就命不久矣呢？而呢個 Alice 亦都神推鬼拱咁樣說服佢老公去食呢個藥喎，亦都注視佢去食呢個藥喎。咁 Alice 其實會唔會係同呢個案情有啲好直接嘅關係呢？但係偏偏呢個角色咧去到咁遲先出現啊嚇。咁我個人就覺得唔算係好理想啦，呢個鋪排。都係有寫一啲關於 Harold 自己嘅內心啦，咁都係唔好噶啦，都係冷酷無情噶啦，因為佢自己兄弟死咗，佢都冇咩惋惜啦，又諗住佢老豆死啦，咁樣都係將呢個角色寫得幾惡劣下嘅。呢一節有好多字，我揀啲有趣啲嘅啦，譬如tête-à-tête 幾有趣，呢個我好細個都學過嘅，聽落去都知道係法文啦，法文字啦，咁英文就成個字照版煮碗吸咗過嚟啦。意思即係一個 private conversation between two people， 或者兩個人做啲 private 啲嘅嘢啦 ，tête-à-tête 文中就點樣用咧？就係話呢個 Harold 同佢太太食飯嗰陣時傾偈啦，佢哋一齊 tête-à-tête。佢哋談話嘅內容咧，佢用個字去形容嘅 desultory， 意思即係如果係喺一個對話嘅形式嚟講咧，呢個字嘅意思咧就係 going from one subject to another。In a half-hearted way， 中文我諗勉強翻譯可以話談天說地嘅，準確啲講就係東一忽西一忽啦，即係咩都講下咯。Desultory，OK，punctilious 喺文中係形容應該係 Harold 啦，對佢太太問佢你點啊？你個 trip 點啊 ？punctiliously 意思即係 showing great attention to detail or correct behaviour。咁我嘅中文就有個成語，我覺得都算準確嘅，一絲不苟啦，一絲不苟啦。作者好中意用呢啲字去形容呢個 Harold 啦，甚至乎佢太太或者佢嘅秘書佢 office 啦， 即係所有嘢都係好 streamline 啊，好精準啊，好顯示到佢嘅財富，但係就係欠缺咗人性嘅，係有批判佢嘅，一路都係好猛烈批判佢嘅，其實都 OK。好啦，咁就呢一節就嚟到呢度啦，下一節我相信就會表現出呢個究竟 Harold 係咪食咗藥就一眠不起呢？咁樣下一節24節再同大家見面啦。